Hi, this is Estelle Erasmus, your host for Freelance Writing Direct. In this short, soundbite-filled podcast, I'll cover everything the freelance and creative writer and author needs to do to move forward with their writing, their creativity, and their career. Through conversations with guests, we'll cover tips, tricks, and actionable strategies. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes and Spotify. Hi, everybody. It's Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so thrilled to announce that my book, Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, is out and available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, IndieBound, and wherever books are sold. So I would love it if you'd pick up a copy, and I think you'll learn a lot. Thanks. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. This is Estelle Erasmus with Freelance Writing Direct, and I am so excited to have Michele Borba as my guest today. And I want to tell you a little bit about her. I'm going to look at her bio from her wonderful best-selling book, Thrivers, which I am holding up. And so she is an internationally renowned educational psychologist and an expert in parenting, bullying, and character development. She is a regular NBC contributor who appears on Today and has been featured as an expert on Dateline, The View, Dr. Phil, NBC Nightly News, Fox and Friends, Dr. Oz and The Early Show, among many, many others. She lives in Palm Springs, California with her husband and is the mother of 3 grown sons. And she has written like 24 books, so we have so much to talk about. Welcome, Michele.
Oh, thank you. I'm so looking forward to this. Thank you.
This is wonderful. So I just have to say something before we begin. Michele was one of the early supporters for me when I told her about my idea of writing a book about writing and teaching people how to do writing. So she was so encouraging, so supportive, and has given me great advice and insight all along the process. So thank you again.
Oh, you are so welcome. And you know, I think what everybody needs to know in this thing called writing, it's lonely. And you got to really find some other people out there who are going to support you. Most of my girlfriends always ask, aren't you done yet? So if you find other people who write, it really helps you because then you can at least lock heads together and get the support you need to move forward.
It really does. And when we first started talking about having you on the podcast, I said, oh, we'll do something about writing a bestseller. And you said something that really struck me. You said, you know what, Estelle, this is my 8th publisher. I have made so many mistakes in the process. And I thought, okay, bingo, I have the title for this episode. You can make mistakes and write a best-selling book, says Thrivers author Michele Borba. So that is the topic of today's show. And I'm so excited to hear about it. So let's get right into it. I mean, you have a best-selling book. Why not do another little show the book? It's so great. It's so instructional. And I have a teenage daughter. So this has been helpful since she was a teenager. Okay, so you told me you made a lot of mistakes getting into publishing, getting to the part where you are today. Can you talk and expand a little bit more on that?
Oh, yeah, because really, in reality, it was an absolute fluke that I made it. And I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. It is, and it's tough, and it's become hyper competitive. But I knew I had a passion, and I knew I had a passion for one particular topic. Way back when the first book I wrote, what did I do? Everything wrong. I didn't realize you were supposed to write this gorgeous proposal. I didn't realize you were supposed to type it up and make it right. What I did was actually get graph paper, and I printed out a proposal on graph paper. I drew some little cute little things around it, some illustrations, and I sent it to 10 publishers.
Wow.
Now, the most amazing thing is if you could look at the graph paper, And I look at all the manuals on how to write a book proposal, and I devour what they're supposed to be looking like. The most amazing thing is I got 8 acceptances.
Well, here's the thing about you. You are, I call you the soundbite queen, because look, I've interviewed you. This is how we met. I was interviewing you for an article, I think for Wired or for the Washington Post or the New York Times, one of the many places that I've interviewed you for. And you just have these succinct, very savvy, very instructive sound bites. And I think that even though you did everything wrong in the formatting of the proposal, your information and your education and your insight came through. It must have, to get 8
well, thank you for
acceptances.
that. Look, I don't think you can write anything of a proposal or a book unless you have a solid idea. And it has to be based on absolute passion of, I'm craving to know the answer for this solid idea. And I think that's what it was. Way back when it was, why do some kids have high self-esteem and others not? And the whole thing was, we're doing everything wrong. So when I wrote it down, it was, everybody just crammed into it. The fascinating thing was, I took the publisher that I wanted, and then the 4 others that I turned down, each asked me to write a book for them. So I ended up with those 24 books. I now had 4 or 5 other different proposals, and it was just absolute. I'd never written a book. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have an agent, and I went, okay, go for it. The other thing I learned is you say yes to things you love. Go for it. Take the risk. It takes a little bit of courage. You are going to be vulnerable, but if you're surrounded by people that you feel like, I think they got it, they know what they're doing. And those publishers and those editors did, they kind of wrapped me under their wings and helped me get through the process.
Wow. So you have this joie de vivre, and you have this attitude of carpe diem, seize the day. And I think that really, it helps with what you're writing, because I think kids have this lack of confidence. There's so much that they are going up against in today's kind of media crazy world. And the way that you put the material forth to show them that they can succeed, and this is how, and to help parents help them, because it's really, the books are for initially the parents who want their kids to have the best shot in what they're doing.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Well, thank you for that. I think one of the other things that's helped me tremendously to writing the last few books is that I do focus groups and I talk to kids. And I discover that I do the science, I do all the research like every good writer does. I mean, I fill up moleskins that are just like, I should have, some kind of
The moleskin
with
notebooks.
moleskins. I go through moleskins like crazy. I never go anywhere without a journal. I mean, I've got, the latest one is blue. So you constantly keep putting ideas down, and that seems to formulate okay, there's the process, or a phrase that generates the next idea. But then I start with the research. Once I've got the idea of, the last one was thrivers. So why do some kids struggle and others thrive? It was really digging deep into the amazing science on resilience. That was all on index cards. Every single bit of research was on index cards till I had stacks of them. And then coming down with the 7 most important character strengths that thrivers or resilient people have in common was Post-its. I started putting them all over the top of my desk, and then began to look at, so what are the 7 that are the most highly correlated, or what are the ones that are teachable? The stacks kept growing, and that became the outline of the book. So I really want to thank moleskins, Post-its, and index cards, because they've been phenomenal. You need organizers. You need to do what works for you to get all of that amazing amount of information down so you can crunch it, and that becomes your outline.
So for you, you didn't do it on a Word document. You used index cards initially and your journal entries, and you kind of
I get to the Word document after I finally have a sense of, so what are the pieces that work? And then I go through the fine tune of what everybody does, of looking what is the outline going to look like? And what are these, if I know here's the 7 or the 5 or the 6 most important key elements, each one of those is going to be a chapter. Now I have a Word document. But I find if I don't have that basic, what is the main points of the main ideas, I could spend 5,000 pages on a Word document and not being able to crunch it down into where's it going.
I want to get back to mistakes also, but how long does it take you to write a nonfiction book?
Unfortunately, a year. It usually only because once the contract comes in, it's a year to be able to, you've got a year, Michele. Now you're going to turn it over in the end of a certain point to be able to give it to the editor or the team. But it takes a lot longer prior to that. I may be working on another book before, but my brain is kicking in for a new idea. And that's when I start with the moleskin of, this is something really important. I start with files of every time there's a new late breaking news that comes out, I have files of all of that research, and somehow it starts to crunch together. Otherwise it would end up being an encyclopedia. You know how that goes. How do you get down to the crunchable points?
So let's get back to your mistakes, because you're saying mistakes, but then you're saying you had a really positive response to them. So for me, mistakes are like a failure. Like, have you had mistakes that have been a failure, but you learned something from it? That's something that our listeners, who are writers at every level and authors at every level.
Oh, I think the mistakes that I have made have been actually in the writing. And if I've had, when I finally get to the point done and I turn it in, what I have learned that I am blessed to have is some of the best editors in the business. They're absolutely mind-boggling. The first editor that I had, his name was Alan Rinsler. Look up his website. The man is absolutely phenomenal. I had no idea that he did all of Hunter S. Thompson's books and Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye. I didn't realize that. I just met him. My agent had sent me to him. He said, I think you'll enjoy him. And by the end of, an hour with him, I said, he's absolutely wonderful. But he really helped me realize that a lot of my English classes from way back when had destroyed my writing. Be more succinct, Michele. You can write 2 words and that's a sentence, Michele. Be crunchier, Michele. Put it down to what you need. He is the one who crafted my style. And that was tremendously helpful once I realized that all those English teachers I had from way back when were not helpful in when it came down to putting it down into the writing point. Write how you feel. Then you can always crunch it till you get to what is the main point you want to say. And he helped me tremendously. The reader was going to be overwhelmed with it. And he kept saying, don't ever get rid of your voice, Michele. Your voice is what sells it. Any writer, your voice is what you need to keep on going with it. Right. But he said you can crunch a lot of those words. I remember one of my favorite things in the whole wide world was going to Key West and going through Ernest Hemingway's home.
I was there.
Isn't it amazing? And his thing that he said was every day was write 1 perfect sentence. And he'd sit there and realize that half the words he had in his sentences weren't necessary. So what's the key point you want without getting rid of your voice? That's what really helped me. And once you have a couple of wonderful editors saying, here's what you need to do, all of a sudden your confidence goes up and your writing style improves.
So how do you get your voice down? Do you pull exactly from what you wrote in your notes, or like, how do you get your voice?
That is back to the Word doc. Once I start writing in that Word document, I write anything that comes out of my head, and I keep writing and writing and writing and writing. And then when I reread, I just keep cutting and cutting and cutting until I get it to the point where that's what I really want to say. What isn't necessary? What's the key points that I want? And then throw in, I think the most important thing is a story or a voice of a child, or what did a parent say? So it becomes more directed towards that audience.
Yeah, in Thrivers, you have a lot of, what we call sidebars and little, and tips and tricks and things written down and bullet points and numbers. And that helps break up the copy so that the reader, and I know this from my days being a glossy magazine editor, it helps the reader to focus and to really get a sense of direction in what they're doing. And so, like you have top 5 takeaways, 1 last lesson, things like that, which helps structure.
Those came from my readers. My readers, when I'd ask them, because usually what I also get to do that's really fun is that I'm a speaker by nature. So I go out and, 3 or 4 times a week, I'm at a school or a district or doing some national program. And what I do before I actually publish the book is try out the topics on the audience. What resonates, what doesn't resonate. And then what I do is it really helps. I think I can do that by who's sitting up, who's clapping. I watch my Twitter feeds. What are they picking up? What are the words? That really helps me. And then the next thing is, if I have some people coming up afterwards thanking me, I would always ask them, what do you need? What would be the kind of book that you would really want to pick up and would help you most? And that's where the tips came in, because what they said was, I want it more like a cookbook. I don't have time to read everything, but if you can crunch it into tips or bullet points, that helps me, because then I'll know what's the most important thing. Was the readers were pushing that direction.
That's great. I mean, it's great that you listen to them, because that's your audience. So that's really wonderful. What other writing mistakes do you feel that you've made, that you've corrected or self-corrected?
I think worrying too much about, is it right? Just get it down and have confidence, because at the very beginning, I'd always be worried about, oh gosh, that writer wouldn't do it, or I bet she didn't do it. And what happens if you start comparing yourself to others or keep looking at others, it takes you down 5 levels. So the first thing I did that was brilliant on my part is I stopped looking at everybody else's stuff and just went for my own. That boosted my own confidence and helped me tremendously. Mistake number 1 is don't look at everybody else's information, because you can look at it when you're all done.
Right.
That's critical. The second thing I think was really helpful, and we'll go back to that, was at the very beginning, I looked at thinking about writing a couple of proposals, went through all the process. And what I hadn't done was what I now do is I have an idea. I go to Barnes and Noble or a really huge bookstore, sit on the floor and pull anything off the shelf that's sort of competitive to me and going, maybe somebody's already got it. How is my book different from it? That was tremendously helpful. And now what I've discovered is that little thing that seems like it's a lot of time and effort actually is phenomenally helpful, because later on there's a section in your proposal called, what's the competition? And you have to actually write the 5 or 6 books that are similar to yours. How is your book different? I've already lined it up. Here's how it's going to be different, how it's going to stand apart. That really helps.
That's really helpful. I actually do a little, here's an Estelle's Edge. I look at the Amazon reviews and I look at the worst review that says like what they feel the book is missing. And I see, is that something that makes sense? Sometimes it's just somebody just grinding, but sometimes it makes sense. Like, oh, I could include that in my book, that kind of idea.
Oh, I love those, because I think those are really helpful if you keep with an open mind. What is missing? What did I need? What is that book lacking? Oh my gosh. Now you got an open edge and you can go, there's where I need to go one step more with my own.
Yes, absolutely. So I love that. If somebody wants to write a book and they have an idea, do you recommend they do what you do? Just like write it on index cards, do a moleskin, or do you think they should just really just start with a Word document?
You have to find your own style. You have to not copy somebody else. I certainly have read everybody else. I love Stephen King's on writing. I love Bird by Bird. I love reading other authors and the troubles and the tips that they come up with. And then when you're done, you'll go, okay, so what works for me? And don't skip that. Whatever is your go-to, keep using that, because that's what's going to help organize you and your thought process.
Now, what about social media? Because I find that I am on it because I share different information, but I find there are times it just becomes too much and I'm like, got to get off, I'm off it. And now I'm trying to get even more structured about my writing. I want to do more writing, but I'm going to make Mondays and Tuesdays my writing days, and I'm going to put an out of office message, and anything that is not urgent, I am going to deal with it on Wednesday. Do you think that's a good way to approach?
I think the key is, if you want to change your behavior, now the psychologist is speaking.
Yeah,
is that you've got to figure out what am I going to go to? What's going to help me the most? And then you got to make sure that you say, I'm going to stick to that schedule. I've got some friends who have a weekend retreat someplace, and every weekend they go to their cabin, and that's what they do. I have other friends who say, nope, I'm only going to write from 6 a.m. till 10 o'clock every morning. My son's a writer. He's a phenomenal writer. And he gets up at 5 a.m. and writes from 5 to 7 every morning. And then he goes to work. So find what works for you. Some people do a word count. I'm going to write 500 words or 1,000 words a day. It makes no difference what it is, as long as you stick to that schedule and what works for you. As far as social media, here's the other thing. I've been writing for a long, long time. And I think what the biggest thing that's challenging for the author world right now is when we first started writing way back when, it was the publisher doing the work for us in terms of publicizing. Now, a very big piece. If you look at even how to write book proposals, in the olden days, it was just, here's your chapter, here's the outline, here's how to submit it. And you'll now see that same writing book is now been changed for a third of the book now is, and how to publicize yourself and how to keep it going, because that's what your publisher is expecting. And your proposal, a big piece of the new proposal is, what are you going to do to make sure that your book's out there? That never had to be 20, 30 years ago.
It's who is your audience and how are you going to bring them in? And that's publicity. It's your platform. It's where you're speaking, what you're doing. So I completely agree with that. You talk about research, and for Thrivers, you found the latest research on what helps kids succeed and resilience and all that. Are there any specific research tools that you use? Are you subscribed to Eureka alerts or something like that?
I do it the old-fashioned way because I'm afraid I'm going to miss some pieces. The first thing I do is I have a Google alert for instance, maybe it's depression or suicidal thoughts or anxiety or stress. I look at those. But the next thing I do is I start just looking at the top, from New York Times to Chicago Tribune to Los Angeles Times, what's hit the market or what's hit out there that psychologists are looking at, because usually they're a little bit on edge prior to what a book does and what comes out. Those really help. And then what I do is I start piling those and copying them through so they have piles and piles off to the side. Then I start the outline of, so what's the commonalities? It's a long process. The research is probably the hardest part of my writing when I'm writing, like Thrivers. The book before that was on selfie, and it was on empathy development. That was really tough too, because how are you going to find the different things that aren't out there that are more current? And then you're looking at, and what's the things that have been out there for years that people are missing, that it's still science-backed evidence, things that we're kind of putting off to the side and not looking at.
Now, when you look at research, are you parsing it? Are you saying oh, this needs to have over 500 participants in a study, or will you take a small study, or it won't work?
I won't, because it has to be really solidly evidence-based with a strong cohort, or in a study with 4 children or in a study of 25 kids, that doesn't help me. But in a study of 1,500 children, or in this study for the last 7 years, looking at 7,500 kids across the US, that's the kind of study I'm looking at. It has to apply. The other thing that's fascinating is I get to work internationally. I've worked on, I think I've spoken on 30 countries. I just came back from Saudi Arabia. I'm on my way next week to the Philippines, and I'm finding that the same issues, which is really interesting to me, are impacting other countries now. We blamed COVID, for instance, when in reality, everything we're seeing right now was pre-COVID. COVID only amplified it. So it's just a staying ahead of the curve of what's going on and what are other countries seeing that are concerns. Because I think we do have a real crisis when it comes to resilience. We better reboot our thinking patterns.
I agree. I mean, I think like you're saying, COVID was a symptom, and then the real situation is the depression and the lack of community, I guess, these days that teenagers are feeling. I mean, I have a teenager now, so it's interesting seeing there's a big change from tween to teen, as you know.
Well, at the CDC, you want to be really, we'll get into one point here. The CDC came out that 1 out of 3 tween girls was suicidal over the last 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
Think of it in your life. We're talking really a reboot. So it's very, very dismal. But the other thing I think that really resonates, if you just write a book with the research, it doesn't help. I don't care who the reader is. My Moleskin, after I start the outline, is now talking to a mom or a teacher or a counselor or a kid and writing their perspective. That helps when I write, here's the tip, or here's what the research says, and here's what a 10-year-old says. And the 10-year-old, the 11-year-old, the 13-year-old, the 17-year-old always matches the research. So it gives it a far stronger point where, and here's what the kids say, it goes right to it.
It's taking compelling stories and
Yes.
tying it around the research.
I don't think people want to read dry things, but I think what resonates most with an adult is when they hear a kid's perspective. They see, here's what the CDC or the American Medical Association or the AAP is saying, or some really prestigious organization. That's the stat. But now, how are you going to make it emotive? It's the stories that always help you when you're writing the book, sell it.
Yeah.
It's the kids' versions of it, or here's what I did in my house, or here's what we're doing in our school.
I think, and I could see that that's probably in your proposals also, because you've had the focus groups, you've had the talks, and you've interviewed people. So you have those stories.
Well, the beginning of my proposal is always a story.
A story. Tell me more about that. So how can a writer make, let's say they're working on a book proposal. So it's taking compelling stories to, like I do, so I say something to my students about writing to the reader if they're doing a pitch to a magazine editor. So they would write the first part of their pitch as if you're actually reading the article, which often starts with dialogue or a compelling story, or you're getting right into an incident. I call the inciting incident. So tell me more on that.
We're on exactly the same page.
We are.
I discovered that if I want to convince an editor, and that's who I really want at this point, I want an editor who my brain is in sync with. And so it's not the house I want the editor. But my thing at the beginning is, how do I convince him or her? It's a compelling story. And then the story goes from, for instance, Thriver starts with the most doom and gloom scenario about this absolutely precious kid. And I begin by describing the typical high school kid. And then I ask her, how was your life going? And she began to say, well, I get up at 4 a.m. to do my swimming at 5. I then go to school at about 7. I take AP classes. I try to get my grades up to such and such. And then I come home and then I do 4 hours of homework. And that's clearly what the typical kid is. And then you're hearing this story and you're getting into her shoes until the next paragraph comes. And I wanted to find out how she was doing. And she had to be hospitalized for severe depression because she tried to end her life. And then the stat is, but she's not alone. And this is why we need to reboot. So it's trying to get the editor or the reader into here's what the book is going to have a solution. But now I'm going to hit you with, and this is why, because our children are hurting. And here's just one of many and telling us that particular angle.
And that's very compelling because it goes to the emotions, and that's what we get in storytelling. We tell stories that elicit emotions. They even did a study that talked about if you bring out certain emotions of excitement in a person, they're more likely to keep reading. They're more likely to want to know more.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. I think when you look at a really good TED Talk, you look at a really good book, when you get done with the book, you're not going to remember the stats, but you're going to remember, oh my gosh, that story on page 33. Find the stories. And that's the next piece is once I get done with the research, all the moleskins are nothing more than how can I weave this in so that all this research now comes into, it's like my child or it's the kid next door. And now you have this personal piece with it. And that seems to be what really sells. That's what has sold the proposals each time is the stories.
That's so helpful to hear. So what's next for you? I mean, you have so much going on. You're speaking on television shows. You're going to the Today Show very often, right?
Yeah, the most fun thing that I would never thought I would ever do, I just finished writing a children's book. And I did it with just an author who I absolutely adore. She contacted me. Her name is Julia Cook. Julia Cook has sold over 1 million copies of books and she's always a children's writer with this absolutely fabulous illustrated books. We sat together. She had read Thrivers and she said, I want to take your book, work with you, and let's work on how we could do it for a young child. And it is so fun. I never realized writing could be so fun because our brains were in sync. If you're going to have a co-author, get somebody that you trust explicitly. Your brains work simultaneously, but she's got a slightly different skill set than you. Oh, that's a win-win. I mean, it was, I'd say a word, she'd say a word of going, oh my God, that's it. And it was really, the whole book was, I got this, but how do you teach superpowers to young kids so that they have them from a very early age?
Is it a picture book or is it a chapter book?
It's a picture book. And it's, first of all, what I didn't realize in picture books, how every word matters so much. Alan Rizzler would say, yep, Michele, that's it. Now you're into every word because you got to really crunch your words.
Yes.
And you got to make sure that they're memorable, but you also got to keep stepping into the shoes of a child. Does he understand the words? And then the next thing you got to do when you're done writing that picture book is that you've written the words, but now what you've got to do in like red or a different color is write it out to the illustrator of what you want the illustrator to do to depict your words. And it's just this three-way street of going with the illustrator, with the other co-author and you. Oh, it is a process.
The turn the page, like what's happening when you turn the page, like everything ties in. I love that. When is the book coming out?
October. It's almost at the finished product. The illustrations are coming through and it's absolutely wonderful. And it has animals. So the eagle is the one who, because a feather is a letter from a bird. And what the eagle does is bounce back superpowers on feathers to every time Charlie, the dog, is trying to help with Hazy, the squirrel, get up a huge mountain and comes up with all different kinds of obstacles. Don't quit is the answer. You got this, but here's 5 ways that you can do it to get over the top. And he succeeds. But in the end, the 5 superpowers are ones that any child can use the rest of their life. I don't care what the challenge is. If you know those, you're going to be able to use them forever.
That's beautiful. I can't wait to read that one,
Oh,
Michele.
I can't either. That's the most fun thing. Have you noticed? You spend your whole life, you're just dying for this. And then the one moment comes when the book comes in the mail and you have like, a half an hour of going, oh my gosh, there's the book.
So where can people find you? You're on Twitter, your website, and obviously your books, and we'll put that all in the show notes.
Thank you. Well, I'm MicheleBorba.com. I'm a 1L Michele, and Borba rhymes with Zorba. So there you go. It's on a website. I'm MicheleBorba.com on Twitter, which I love. Really like Twitter. I got finally on Instagram, and it's Dr. Michele Borba. But you got to find what works for you, because you can get overwhelmed with all the social media.
I'm on TikTok now. I actually like it. I'm enjoying it. It's fun. Yeah.
You got to find what works for you and don't listen to anybody else. If it's a match for you, just like your writing style, just like it's an index card, is it a Moleskine or is it a Word doc? Find what works and keep going with it, because that's what's going to help you succeed.
Great advice from Michele Borba. Thank you so much, Michele. It's been such a pleasure having you today.
Likewise.
Okay, everybody, lots more to come, and stay tuned for more on Freelance Writing Direct. Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. And if you're interested in sponsoring an episode or 2 or doing an follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.